All right. Hey, we have Ralph Sanchez on the line today, best-selling author of The Diabetic Brain and Alzheimer's Disease, a book that connects the dots between type 2 diabetes, type 3 diabetes, and Alzheimer's. Apart from Ralph's extensive functional medicine clinical experience in working with his patients, he spent over 2 decades intensively researching the risk factors and related causes of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. We are in for a treat today. So Ralph, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Are you married, kids? What do you like to do for fun? And what gets you up in the morning?
Hi, Dr. Tressler. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on your show. And I'm excited to share with the citizenry of Pittsburgh, right? Because you're dedicated to helping those people. And of course, anybody that's listening to this. But what gets me up in the morning is partly my passion for all of this. And I have a mission in my life, that started with my vocational calling around integrative medicine. Started out as an acupuncturist in 1995 and then went into a very integrative style practice with functional medicine as sort of the core to much of the work that I did. But I went into this healthcare model because I wanted to be of service in the world. I really wanted to make a difference. And I have a mission to create a nonprofit because I'm not married. I'm a single guy. I don't have any children. And I want to leave a legacy, so I don't have a legacy to pass on through my children or anything like that. So I want to build up a legacy, a nonprofit around my Alzheimer's work. And that nonprofit is going to be dedicated to helping people in various aspects. I want to work with animals and children more. And I want to leave this nonprofit for the world. And that's what partly gets me up in the morning, is dedicated to making that happen before I move on.
I love it. And I don't know if you're looking for a lady, but ladies, you got a good looking guy that's healthy, and you're probably going to kick me on this, but I always, I have 5 kids and I always,
5.
Yeah.
Wow.
As they were getting older, I'm like, I pray that they all find somebody healthy that believes the same belief and, the whole line. So, anyhow, I thought that was funny.
Yeah, it's wonderful if 2 people like that are on the same page, right?
Yeah.
As far as eating and lifestyle.
If not, it can ruin a relationship.
Well, that can be difficult, and it's pretty disconcerting to be on a path of health and wellness and your partner isn't on board and may even scoff at the idea.
Right. And that's why I'm so excited to have you explain your process with Alzheimer's and the risk factors in reversing this, because whether it's in a relationship or just ourselves, why not take the risk factors out to be healthy? It's so exciting to be vibrant, wake up every morning and do what we want to do. I can see it in your skin tone, in your face, your vibrancy. You just look alive. And that's how we should all be. So let's shed some light on this, Ralph. Why don't you tell the listeners, explain where this problem is and how did you discover this as a problem?
Well, I discovered it as a potential problem for myself. So I was partly motivated to go into Chinese medicine and healthcare in general. I was looking for something like that, and as a vocation, as I said, and I wanted to serve people, but I was also motivated to fix my own problems. Prior to going into medicine, I was in the landscaping field, and I had my own business, my own landscaping business, and I was young and stupid, in my 30s, and not careful about how I handled pesticides. And, the plants needed to be treated often with sprays to control infestations of one sort of or another. And I just wasn't careful with the pesticides. And I actually, prior to my landscaping work, I worked with an individual who had me help him in his landscaping business. And I helped him in some greenhouses, was using pesticides in those greenhouses, was not protected at all. And so it wasn't long after all of that that I started to feel pretty lousy. And I got some help with that, somebody that was an integrative type of acupuncturist. And this was way before I was even thinking about doing anything like that. And that helped me a great deal, but even that person missed the boat in terms of connecting why I was feeling so terribly to my work, and the pesticides. And then after that, I started to get into trying to find out answers for myself and got into nutrition and started to see this amazing world of nutrition and supplements and the amazing things they could do in terms of interacting with our biochemistry, right? So I thought, well, there's got to be answers there for me. And so I avidly dove into, how I could help myself, how I could get myself over the hump and feel better. And one thing led to another. I got very interested in being of service. I worked with an organization called SEVA, S-E-V-A, a wonderful, wonderful organization based here in San Francisco that does work worldwide and is dedicated to this model of service and one's path in life as a vehicle for really, really facilitating an awareness and consciousness, if you will, about your path and service and helping other people. And so all of that dovetailed, and I decided, okay, I've got to do something more meaningful with my life than my landscaping work. And I started looking around, got some advice, and I was thrilled with the idea that I could get a license to practice medicine, by going to either a chiropractic school or a school of acupuncture and Chinese medicine. And so that's what I did. I chose Chinese medicine because of the philosophy and the background. I was a very dedicated meditator at the time. And I had incorporated that into my life in terms of a way of moving forward with a more spiritually minded path, right? Something that was going to help me fulfill my destiny and my calling, if you will. And so between meditation and Chinese medicine, I thought I had found my thing. And soon after I got into Chinese medicine, I was working a lot in the in the HIV/AIDS community, because acupuncture and Chinese medicine was huge in that community. So I was really thrilled about the whole experience I was having and my path forward. And of course, besides helping people, I wanted to help myself. That's what partially motivated me to get into this field of healthcare, because I still had my issues, and I thought, got to stay on top of this. And when I started looking at my history in context of my potential health issues, not only what was going on with me now, but the whole idea of a prevention model, right, is working on your health and wellness in terms of your aging process and what that's going to look like in your 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I was very vested in making sure that I got to a point. I'm 72 now, but back then I was in my late 40s, early 50s, and I was thinking ahead. And that's actually a term I use a lot, think ahead. Because if you're not thinking about what your health is going to be like in your 60s, 70s, and 80s, in your 40s and 50s, it already may be creeping up on you in terms of the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And that's what I started to realize in my research and in my own history. I had had a severe brain concussion, a history of head trauma. One incident alone ups your risk for Alzheimer's or a dementia later in life. And of course, the pesticides are very strongly connected to a risk in Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and other neurological disorders. And along the way, and this is a long story, I won't get into it, but because of the pesticides, I incurred what's called a mercury body burden. You know, I was mercury toxic. And when I was looking at all the research around this, the pesticides and the mercury, I thought, oh my God, that's a huge connection to what's going on with me. And so I documented it through a medical test. It's called a mercury chelation challenge test. And sure enough, my mercury was off the chart. And so I had to undergo a very intensive mercury detoxification, felt much better because of it. But I also was very happy about the fact that I had reduced my risk, you know, in another way for more severe health issues, you know, later on in life. So that's what really prompted the path about getting into this research on Alzheimer's disease. I also found that genetics played a huge role in terms of one's risk. So once I started to put all of this information together, I was just fascinated. I was just really captivated by it all. The science was amazing. I saw the science emerging in the late 90s. It was still quite in its dark ages in many ways. It was still focusing on the two primary lesions associated with Alzheimer's disease, plaques and tangles. And they were saying, well, these are the causes. And of course, now we know that this is part of the disease process and a very toxic component, but it's not necessarily the cause. The cause happens much earlier in life before you get dementia. We now know that Alzheimer's disease has at least a 20, perhaps 30-year or more timeline where you begin having problems that are not noticeable. That's called a preclinical phase. And in the preclinical phase, your brain starts to have a disease process associated with Alzheimer's disease. And if that isn't arrested, you morph into the next stage, which is called mild cognitive impairment. And in mild cognitive impairment, that's where it becomes noticeable. Memory problems, thinking, confusion, perhaps in its more severe form, but you just have problems kind of executing. It's called executive function. And so you have problems with your judgment, executing things according to what you need to be doing to run your life, right? So in mild cognitive impairment, you know, that's when it's more noticeable. And if people are smart, they'll go to their doctor and say, you know, I'm having memory issues and I'm not feeling so great about, you know, my cognitive function. And hopefully if you get to the right person, he's going to get very proactive with you and start looking at your history. Because as I write about in my book, The Diabetic Brain and Alzheimer's Disease, what are the primary risk factors in aging that lend to the risk of a dementia? Apart from Alzheimer's, just dementia, because there's different types of dementia. And the second leading cause of dementia is cardiovascular disease. So that's one of the things that prompted my research, because one genetic marker called the APOE4 risk variant, it's a genetic marker, it's a variant of the APOE gene. That variant doubles, triples, or up to 10 times increases your risk depending upon the literature, some people say with one copy of that variant, your risk is 2 to 4 times greater. With 2 copies, because you carry either 1 or 2, or you don't carry any. There's 3 variants that people carry. And if you carry 1, your risk is 2 to 4 times. And if you have 2 copies, then your risk can be as much as 10 to 15 times. It's not a determinant, and I want to make that clear because there's early onset Alzheimer's disease that's pretty much a genetically determined disorder, and there's late onset Alzheimer's disease, which is what you get when you get into your 60s, 70s, and 80s. Early onset Alzheimer's disease comes on before the age of 60, whereas late onset comes on after the age of 65 normally. And 1 in 10 people after the age of 65 are diagnosed with late onset Alzheimer's disease, and it increases as a person ages. So by the time you hit 80, 85, that risk is going to be 4 times, if not more. So that's why it's so important to think ahead, right? Because if you're not working with a proactive healthcare provider, somebody that really knows their stuff about the aging process and the risk for these issues as you age, well, he's not telling you, hey, you're in your late 40s, early 50s. I'm seeing signs of blood sugar metabolism problems. I'm seeing issues with your cholesterol and triglycerides and your fasting blood sugar. You're not a diabetic yet, but you're pre-diabetes. And guess what? If you're pre-diabetes, that's a huge problem for your brain, right? And not to mention that diabetes and cardiovascular disease go hand in hand. And so the metabolic issues around diabetes is one part of that spectrum, but the cardiovascular disease is the other part of the spectrum that increases your risk for Alzheimer's disease, because in cardiovascular disease, the circulation of blood to your brain is impaired. That goes along with atherosclerosis, the buildup of plaque in your arteries, plaque and calcium, right? And that migrates into your brain. And that's a very convoluted story. But the impaired circulation alone into your brain, and not getting enough oxygen, it's called hypoxia, ischemia, and which can lead to what are called mini strokes, transient ischemic attacks, right? And all of that's related to cardiovascular disease and diabetes, the risk for TIAs and strokes. And that's huge. That's huge for your risk for dementia. And so those are overlapping issues. The cardiovascular disease, the diabetes, and what's happening to your brain as a result of all of that. And of course, we have the diet and lifestyle component to all of that, right? So there are layers to all of this, So where does it all begin? Well, it begins with diet and lifestyle and genetics, So there's a great term I put in my book that genetics load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger, right? So you can be an ApoE4 carrier, but it will never be a problem in your life if your diet and lifestyle are in order. If you've been taking care of yourself and you're really proactive about prevention. And let me just throw out a disclaimer that none of what we're talking about is meant to be construed as medical advice, right? We're not here to say, you may have a problem because this and this, and you need to listen to what we're saying as a medical advice viewpoint. We're saying that if you're experiencing problems like what we've been talking about, you need to go and work with somebody that knows their stuff, that's a qualified physician. And if you're already having those problems. Because it's been shown, there's a doctor in the Alzheimer's community, and there's several of them. All right, there are already clinics and physicians out there that will take somebody in trouble and stabilize the progression of the disease process if they catch it early enough. Because there is evidence that if you catch this early enough, it can be reversed. We know that diabetes can be reversed, and there are studies now saying that if you start tackling this issue at midlife, when you might be already having these issues with other risk factors and cognitive problems, mild cognitive impairment, you may be able to reverse, you might, okay? You might be able to reverse that disease process. And that all depends on the kind of help you get, the extensive overview of you, because what I talk about in my book and what the essence of functional medicine is that it's a personalized medicine. It's not about the diagnosis and just prescribing a drug based on that diagnosis. It's about an extensive understanding of a person's history, and tying that history into their biochemistry, their metabolism, their organ function. So it's doing a lot of what's called functional testing to understand what led to this disease process, right? Why is this disease process manifesting in this person, right? That's the essence of a functional medicine approach, is really understanding the core issues as to why a disease process is manifesting in a certain person, right? And then you can start to really, through the testing and the history evaluation, put two and two together as a way of blueprinting, designing a path forward, because now you have evidence. And this is also in some ways called evidence-based medicine, right? So now you have the evidence to adequately tackle what's going on with the person at the very core, the things that gave rise to this, and hopefully through a very proactive program, start to reverse some of these things, or at least stabilize it to the point where it's not going to crush you as you age into, a more severe problem associated with Alzheimer's or dementia, or being debilitated in some other way and winding up, in an assisted living center in not very good shape. I've seen a lot of that. My mother passed away of dementia. Fortunately, and this is the other caveat, why people should be very interested in the model of risk reduction and hopeful prevention, is because if you get to that place later on in life where you need a lot of help, it's a budget buster. If you haven't saved a lot of money, my mother was very thrifty and she saved a lot of money. So when this problem arose in my mother, we were able to provide for her in a great place. And a great place now costs at least $9,000, $10,000, $11,000 a month. So if you're not prepared to pay that, and if you don't have family around to make sure that you get that care and that they're going to be your advocates, it's not a pretty situation. It's a dire situation. So very, very important reasons on many levels as to why people should begin looking at this and thinking ahead earlier in life about what their later life is going to look like.
I love that. And the think ahead, if we don't think ahead, we end up in a crisis. It's like, going for a ride, not knowing where you're going. You end up somewhere that you don't want to be. And with our health, like you were saying, there's a point that it can't be reversed 100%. It can be altered and changed and improved. But the further down the disease track we go, the harder it is, the more extensive it is. And expensive, and you suffer. So it's like, why we've got to start thinking different. And I'm glad we're talking about this. And the one thing that you were talking about with how diseases, conditions can overlap, I would think that any health crisis, any health condition overlaps with just about everything in the body biochemically and how they work together. We may not be able to see it and understand it, but if the liver isn't functioning, the whole body is under stress to some degree. If the muscles are atrophying, the whole body is under stress. And
Yeah,
I think we look at, and we have to say, let's not just look at Alzheimer's and saying, well, I'm not a risk factor, I am a risk factor. Let's look at it and say, we're all a risk factor. We're all a risk factor for any disease and any condition. So if we approach it and say, let's just get our entire body and mind healthy, then our risk for any of this, like you said, it's not like we're out trying to give you advice and treat. It's let's lower our risk factor and be
exactly.
healthy. So why don't we dive into
And I just want to mention, you hit on something that a lot of clinicians and even people, proactive about their health don't think about, and that is in the aging process and losing muscle mass, right? It's called sarcopenia, right? And people that are not active and their nutrition isn't the best, they losing muscle mass is a part of aging, but it can be accelerated. And guess what? Sarcopenia is tied into the risk for Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Okay, just the loss of your muscle mass, and what's going on there biologically tremendously affects your brain.
I love it. And why don't we dive into diet and lifestyle? Let's look clinically and say, okay, what should we be doing? Let's all approach this as, hey, we could be a victim to this. So let's just erase it. And I think I do some workshops on digital dementia where the right side of the brain, because of sitting at a computer, they say now that kids under age 18 are averaging about 7.5 hours a day on some type of computer screen. Adults are 10 hours and 45 minutes, which is causing the right side of the brain to begin to malfunction, which we're going to see an increase of 15% early onset of dementia. This is radical. And if we don't get a handle on this, we don't look at this now and say, let's start implementing these strategies with ourselves and our children. By the time we realize it, it's going to be too late. So let's dive into this. I want to hear your expertise here. What do we need to do? What's best for us?
Well, a diet and lifestyle, as I said previously, is where it all begins. And I have a second book that will be out soon. It's called The Improved Mind Diet. So I'm going to talk about a diet here a little bit because it's a huge component, and it dovetails into the risk, reducing the risk for Alzheimer's disease and dementia in many ways. And I picked the title, The Improved Mind Diet, because back in around 2015, some research crept up that was built on earlier research that showed that certain foods and certain diet patterns reduced the risk for Alzheimer's disease and aging. And I started to notice that back in the early 2000s, with the research around certain fruits and vegetables. And I'll never forget when I started to see the research popping up around grape juice and apple juice, and those being actually very, very protective in terms of, a neurological disease as you age. And I thought, this is fascinating. What is in grape juice and apple juice? And now we know it's a huge world. This was back in, the year 2000. And while everybody knows that grapes, especially dark grapes, can be good for you, And there was also the French paradox, so what is wine made up? It's made up of grapes. And there's constituents in wine that are actually very good for your heart and your brain, right? And so seeing all that, I was already, like I said previously, early on in our discussion, sold on the fact that, there was these things around diet and lifestyle that could vastly improve, not only one's health, but also reduce the risk for aging-associated health disorders. And as I looked at nutrition thing more and more, I was just really sold on the fact that nutrition played a huge role. I was seeing studies popping up around the Mediterranean diet as being a component that was being shown in studies and population studies where they had a reduced risk for Alzheimer's disease. And not by then, it was pretty much a pretty vast topic in terms of cardiovascular disease, right? That started to really become big in terms of diabetes. So, it's just one of those things that, again, across the board, diet plays such a huge role, in aging-related health disorders, the most common ones, diabetes and heart disease and Alzheimer's disease. And then in 2015, a group of researchers got together and said, well, look, there's some foods here, particularly berries and leafy greens, that have been shown over and over and over again to be the most protective for your brain and in aging in relation to a risk for Alzheimer's disease. So they underwent a couple of studies and they coined the MIND diet. And what they did in the MIND diet studies is that they took the Mediterranean diet and they took another diet model, a pattern. It's called the DASH diet. The DASH diet is the dietary approach to stop hypertension. That's what it stands for. And because there was some evidence that the DASH diet was also good for you, but I'm not a big fan of certain components of the DASH diet. And what they did, the researchers around the MIND diet, is that they took supposedly the best of both worlds, the DASH and the Mediterranean diet, but they vastly reduced the carbohydrates. They reduced the dairy, and also in the DASH diet, the allowance for certain foods that was greatly reduced in the MIND diet was pretty much eliminated, which again had to do with dairy and carbohydrates, and especially refined carbohydrates, okay? So they incorporated a MIND diet model with certain foods, and they lined that up very, very neatly in their study in terms of portions of these foods on a regular basis. And they showed that the MIND diet was a superior approach to even the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet, particularly the DASH diet. The Mediterranean diet performed very, very well. But here was the difference between the Mediterranean diet and the MIND diet, that you only needed a moderate adherence to the MIND diet to actually have significant outcomes, whereas that was not true in the Mediterranean diet. And in the MIND diet, just a moderate adherence was significant, a 35% reduction, and a very good adherence was like 53%, 54% reduction of risk. So it was quite significant. And I thought, oh gosh, this is, just building up on all the other research. And I thought, this is going to be a book, because I was already in the middle of formulating my thoughts around the diabetic brain and Alzheimer's disease. Because around that time, also around 2015, and I could be wrong about Yeah, I think the mind diet studies were around that, but around 2015, the idea of a type 3 diabetes of the brain started to surface in a study that coined that phrase because it saw that blood sugar metabolism and particularly insulin problems were a huge issue in the brain in terms of what happened in the Alzheimer's disease continuum, the disease process. And so they said, my gosh, this looks like a type of diabetes. We're going to say it's a type 3 diabetes. And right after that, there was an explosion of many, many studies looking at the insulin resistance model of diabetes. And that's the core of my book, is how insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes relates to type 3 diabetes and the insulin resistance that's going on in your brain. And I take it a step further because the overlapping issues, again, between type 2 diabetes and blood sugar metabolism and how that works in the body and the brain is just pretty astounding in terms of, again, all of these converging issues between the body and the brain. So getting back to the diet, they showed that the berries and the leafy greens were, the primary components to this. But when I saw that, I thought, I got to write a book around this, and got busy with that a couple of years ago when I was finishing up my first book. And I decided, while the focus on nutrition is very important in terms of what they talked about, the components of your diet, whether it was leafy greens and berries and a little bit of fish and whatnot, olive oil, of course. The interesting thing about the Mind Diet studies is that they didn't emphasize the olive oil component to it at all. And I thought, and when I saw little things about that, I go, my book is going to be about all of the other factors that are so important. I emphasize olive oil a lot. You cannot be doing anything better for your brain and your heart than getting a good, high quality extra virgin olive oil into your diet on a regular basis. And I just want to touch on the role of fats, because fats are good for your brain and they're good for your body. Don't let people lead you astray and say fats are bad for you. The idea of that, it arose from studies where animal studies and people that ate too much saturated fat, had some problems. And of course, it's all about balance, right? It's not about saturated fat being bad for you, because as a matter of fact, if your diet has too many omega-3s in ratio to other fats, that's not a good thing either. It's all about the balance. So there's nothing wrong with saturated fat as long as you have, a healthy amount of omega-3s. And you talked about, before the show, we were talking a little bit, you talked about being a meat eater. There's nothing wrong with being a meat eater. And a lot of doctors will say, don't eat meat, it's bad for you. It's got too much saturated fat. Well, that's just a small part of the story. First of all, is it free range and organic? That's the real key, okay? If you eat a lot of commercial meat, yeah, that's not good for you, okay? Because the ratio of what are called omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids, excuse me, in that meat is very unhealthy and it's pro-inflammatory. But that's not the case with free-range organic meats, which includes chicken, as well too. So you want to be getting free-range and organic anything type of meat, and chicken, poultry, and you want to be getting some fish. As long as you have that balance, and getting that olive oil in there, and if you're having problems with your cognitive function, guess what? one of the healthiest fats for your brain is saturated fat in the form of what are called medium chain triglycerides that are derived from coconut fat and palm oil fat, right? And so medium chain triglycerides provide medium chain fatty acids that are utilized in producing ketones. And ketones are used preferentially in your brain when you're struggling with glucose, okay? And it actually can override the problem of not being able to burn glucose as you age and this type 3 diabetes problem, all right? And certain people, like diabetics and women have twice the incidence of Alzheimer's disease. And one of the reasons they have twice the incidence is because of this blood sugar problem, that they're not able to utilize blood sugar in the brain adequately. And it has to do with estrogen, okay? So a saturated fat derived from coconut fat, medium chain triglycerides, is actually really good for you. And it's something that some people, well, it's huge in the athletic community, but it's huge in the health and wellness community. Many people have popularized that movement, including, you probably are well aware of David Asprey and Bulletproof Coffee and that whole movement. But many people have pioneered that. And the whole takeaway is that that may be very, very useful and appropriate for you as you age. And it complements and is an important component to making sure that your brain metabolism, because one of the things that I say is huge, and this is coming up with the whole ketogenic model, which is what we're talking about here, is ketogenesis. Ketogenesis and caloric restriction, huge components to this model of approaching not only aging and reversing diabetes and supporting issues related to cardiovascular disease, but also your brain, right? So it's very, very important to be aware of that these models are very useful interventions. I will never forget when I was watching about 10 years ago a PBS special about a British doctor. And I always recommend this video to people that don't know this world very well. And he went on a path of discovery into what the major clinics and institutions in the world, around the world, were doing that were reversing diabetes. And by and large, they were all doing the same thing. It was a model built on intermittent fasting and caloric restriction, okay? So that is huge. If you have problems, those interventions can be a lifesaver, and they really should be guided, okay? A lot of people go out there and they start doing this stuff. God bless you, but if you have health issues, you should be guided on how all of this is really working out for you, because I mentioned the functional testing model, right? So what's your baseline? What are you trying to fix? What are your problems? And if you're going to incorporate these models, how is it all shaking out over the months and years that you're doing this work, Well, you want to keep it accountable, through certain testing, just to make sure you're on the right path and you're getting the results that not only match, how you're looking and feeling, which hopefully is really good, but also how it is represented in those biomarkers. And those biomarkers that tell the tale of what's going on in your brain and your body, which I talk a lot about in the book, The Diabetic Brain and Alzheimer's Disease. I say, track your biomarkers. get with somebody that's going to be looking at your fasting blood sugar, your hemoglobin A1C, issues related to cardiovascular disease. Track those biomarkers. Make sure you're making progress. Those are critical biomarkers, and there's many, many others, that can be incorporated into this whole model. But just touching back on the diet is a huge component to all of this, because it could be a ketogenic diet, a diet built to caloric restriction, a diet like the Mind diet, any of those diets can be appropriate. And in the improved Mind diet, I take those models and go another level with, what again is a more personalized approach. So it's one thing to say all of these diets, especially something like the Mediterranean diet, they're good for you. They are. But they actually can be improved depending upon your needs and what your biomarkers are saying, right? So the Mediterranean diet includes, grains, right? And grains are a good, healthy food, but not everybody can tolerate grains that well. They may have to go to a very low grain type of diet. And we all know that there's one issue with grains that a lot of people have, and a lot of people don't know they have the problem, and that's gluten. So you got to make sure that if you're going to be having grains in your diet, that gluten isn't a problem for you. And I talk about that in the Improved Mind diet. Another thing that I talk about is a factor related to no matter how healthy your diet is, okay, one of the things that can actually kind of offset some of the benefits, especially in aging, is how you cook those foods. So, and that is especially true. So, Dr. Tressler and all the other meat eaters in the world, including myself, this is especially true for meat eaters, okay? Why? Because when you cook your meats at high temperature, when you grill and broil and fry and roast, you're actually turning that food into some toxic byproducts that are called advanced glycation end products. And there's a great acronym for that. It's called AGES, 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 advanced glycation end products. So the whole browning issue, the whole high temperature cooking, and I described that quite a bit in the book, is actually pretty deleterious. And it's shown in the research that it can be an independent risk factor. The accumulation of AGEs in cooking can be an independent risk factor for accelerating, diabetes in an individual, and heart disease and Alzheimer's disease, okay? So look, if you're young, I grilled and fried and all of that stuff when I was younger. And if you're in your 20s and 30s and you just got to have that, go to town. But when you start hitting your 50s and 60s, start curbing some of that, I'm very careful about how I cook my meats, and I do have some beef and chicken on a regular basis. I eat a lot of fish. And, but it's how those foods are cooked that are important. So very, very low temperature cooking is desirable. The lower you cook it, under 200 degrees, doesn't accumulate as many AGEs in the cooking process. So it's something for people to think about. Slow cookers can be really good that way because you can control the temperature.
As you were going through, I'm taking notes, and every note I did, you hit it on your next statement. So I'm glad my mind is working pretty good. Because I was thinking this is all inflammatory diet.
Yes,
we got to get away from inflammation. And
right.
does inflammation? I've heard some things that inflammation in the body, like the diet we take inflames the body. Is that the same type of inflammation that affects the brain and can cause plaque.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So that, again, it's all this overlapping stuff. What happens in your body happens in your brain. Okay? It's that simple. These are not two isolated universes. They're connected. They're connected by nerves and blood, and so you can have a very pro-inflammatory diet, a very pro-inflammatory disease process like diabetes and heart disease or autoimmune disease. And all of that inflammation gets migrated into the brain. It's really a huge component to this. And it's something that I'm glad you brought up, because in all my ranting here, I failed to emphasize the inflammation component. And there's another component to the inflammation angle, and I describe it in the book. It's called oxidative stress. So inflammation and oxidative stress are what I refer to as the kissing cousins of these disease processes, and any of these age-related disorders, they're a byproduct. They can either stimulate or are a byproduct. So I have a very interesting story. I know we don't have enough time, but I had a urinary tract blockage that I thought was a prostate problem. And because I thought it was a prostate problem, I did a really stupid thing. I didn't go to a urologist and I didn't get it examined. And I figured I will take care of it. So I let it go on for some years. And when it got really bad, and I noticed it got really bad because I was tracking my biomarkers, right? And I noticed my kidney function was starting to suffer. And I go, holy cow, what's going on here? I rushed over and guess what? As I was tracking my biomarkers, I saw my fasting blood sugar was going up. I was having issues with triglycerides. And I go, this can't be. My diet is perfect. I'm exercising, I meditate. I'm invested in this whole model of health and wellness and aging. How can this be happening to me? And so when I went to the urologist to figure out what was going on with my not being able to urinate, he said, your prostate is fine. He checked and he said, your prostate is fine. And we did an ultrasound. He said, there it is. You have a little flap in your sphincter that controls the flow of urine from your urinary bladder. And every time it opens up to release that urine, that flap falls over and inhibits the flow. And so what had happened for me ignoring that? The chronic inflammation, the kidney stress from all of that started to push my blood sugar, my triglycerides up. It started to push me into metabolic syndrome, Dr. Tressler, okay? In spite of the fact that I had a great diet and I was exercising. So you can have a stimulus, in spite of all the good things that you're doing, you can have another stimulus that's affecting your biological health and your metabolic health a great deal. And if you're not really proactive about your health and having somebody check on you on a regular basis, you can overlook these things, They're easy to overlook, and you can start putting yourself into problems that ordinarily could have been avoided. So, it's all about prevention in many ways, right?
That's a great point, and I'm glad you shared that story. I was thinking, we're talking about the brain and inflammation and the healthy fats. There's also, from a chiropractic standpoint, I remember seeing a study by Roger Speary back in 1971, medical doctor on brain research, and found that movement of the spine pushed the cerebral spinal fluid. About 90% of the 90% of the nourishment from the cerebral spinal fluid comes from movement of the spine. And I looked at that and I thought, first of all, we have to have good posture and good alignment, good movement. So we have to be moving. And then I think, if we have inflammation, if we have an inflammatory diet, not only do joints and organs and everything else get inflamed, but our spine gets inflamed. We're blocking nerve flow. We're blocking cerebral spinal fluid. So we're inhibiting the fluid, the nourishment to the brain through spinal fluid. So there's just another factor. So when we look at, and as you were just going, I loved the information today, and is we're looking at all these parameters. We have to say there's not one. He clarified that there's many, and we just start moving in this direction. Start to eat more fats, eat the olive oil, get the coconut oil. I do the MCT in my coffee every day. I have an organic coffee. I put some MCT, and sometimes I put some organic ghee in, and I love it. And I'll do the intermittent fasting. So that was another question. I'm like, wonder if he's going to say intermittent fasting. As soon as I thought you said intermittent fasting. And
those intermittent fasting, caloric restriction, and ketogenesis, it's a cure for many things. It really, really is. I encourage that a lot. I talk about that in the Improved Mind Diet. And it's something that people, the problem with those diets is the adherence rate is very low, okay? They're difficult to incorporate. But, if you're guided, and are working with somebody that really understands you're having a problem with this and can work around those issues, even if you're doing a little bit of it, it can make a huge difference along with other things, okay? So it doesn't have to be super strict, and I want to really emphasize that a lot of people have have gotten this information and started to experiment, and they get information that always isn't that helpful. And is a little off base. So it's important to get it from somebody that really knows. One of the things that some people often hear is that if you do a 12-hour overnight fast, that really can make a huge difference. Well, if you have health issues related to diabetes and other things, it's not going to make that big a difference. I got to tell you, you got to go to more severe intermittent fasting. You got to be doing at least 24 hours, at least 24 hours. 18 hours, which a lot of people talking about, can be useful too. And maybe along with other things like I talked about, if that's all you can do, it'll help. But again, what are those other things? You got to be really guided in this process. And again, you got to be tracking your biomarkers to make sure all of this is working for you. So I really encourage people to work with somebody, especially if they're already in a little trouble with their health, to make sure that they're getting the results that they need, right?
Comes down to results. So let me ask you this, as we kind of head into the tail end, what would 3 things be that they could implement to start making a difference? What do you think your top 3 would be?
Well, again, it's everything, no matter what we're talking about in health and wellness, it begins with diet and lifestyle, right? So exercise, some kind of a regular exercise pattern is very, very important, whether it's just even walking. One of the things we weren't able to touch on is that everything related to diet and lifestyle supports the formation of new brain cells, which is called neurogenesis, throughout our lifetime, well into our aging process. And if you do enough of this, you can actually compensate for some issues related to a disease process that's going on in your brain. So neurogenesis through diet and lifestyle, and that lifestyle incorporates not only exercise, but social engagement and social activities and brain challenging activities. All of those things can be really wonderful in terms of your health and brain wellness as you age. So lifestyle includes the exercise, but also the social stuff and the brain challenging stuff. Don't let your mind stagnate as you as you age. Always be engaged in something that's stimulating to your mind in one way or another. And social activities is one of them. Another one could be continuing education of some sort of or another thing, hobbies, whatever it may be, okay? And then so the dietary component. So besides the lifestyle, we covered the diet. It's crucial that you get, the healthy vegetable and fruit aspect into your diet. Look very carefully at the types of meats that you're eating, whether they're free range, organic, or not, and how much of those, how you cook those could be very important, so your diet overall and dietary patterns, it actually can be very, very helpful if you're, working with somebody that really can support that model in a more progressive way. Those are huge things, but there's a lot there that a person can do on their own, and as I learned through my own path, I learned a lot on my own, but it wasn't until I got into the science that I really understood how all of that worked and how I could really kind of make it work better for me based on my circumstances, so the science end of this is really important. Get some help with that. Work with somebody that knows the science, that knows the research, that diligently is staying on top of that so he or she can best help you with something that's personalized.
That's great advice. And I think if we start heading in this direction, we just start making action steps today, you'll start to find your path. And just like finding this podcast, you're going to have resources, and the resources with the Diabetic Brain and Ralph's new book coming out, you've got to get your hands on these things. This is going to be linked on the page, and read it. And I always tell my listeners, when they get a good book like this, don't just read it and put it aside. I read with my pen and my highlighter, and I usually read a book slow if it's really good, unless it's entertaining. And I don't read entertaining books. I read educational stuff. So I read a little bit, I highlight, and then I stop and I see how can I implement it in my life. If I get it implemented and I make a change, then I start with the next chapter, and I just do it as layers. So you take a book like that, I'm sure it is, that it's going to be a learning book. It's going to be a book that you can read and implement.
It really is a learning book, and I really want to emphasize that there's a lot of science in here. This is for the serious reader. This is for the reader that really thinks, oh, my mom had Alzheimer's, my dad had dementia, it probably runs in my family. I really need to understand what this is all about. And my book is dedicated on education. So there's a lot of science in there. It's going to be a difficult read for the casual readers, somebody who's just kind of casually interested in this. It's really only for the very serious reader and somebody that needs, a step down in the information. They can get that in my podcast, like the podcast I'm doing here with you. At my Facebook page, I have the Alzheimer's Solution Facebook page, and I do a live event every weekend where I'm educating, I'm talking about the practical things, the practical information based on science that people can apply. One of the most fascinating things that has arisen in the last few months, Dr. Tressler, is the overlapping issues between COVID-19 and the risk for Alzheimer's disease. And I've been talking about that for the last 6 weeks on the Alzheimer's Solution Facebook page, where the very same risk factors that increase your risk for a serious problem with COVID-19 are the same risk factors that increase your risk for Alzheimer's disease and aging, right? And inflammation is a huge component to all of that. And reducing your risk for one reduces your risk for the other, right? Absolutely. So that's why people have been talking about this also as an opportunity. Now that you know that COVID-19 can be a big problem for you because you're overweight, and we didn't talk about the obesity angle that much, but obesity and heart disease and diabetes and hypertension, which are all connected. If you have issues there, you might have a more serious problem when you're infected with the coronavirus, right? Well, the same is true in Alzheimer's disease. You know, if those risk factors are ongoing and not arrested early in your life, you may have a problem later in your life. That's what we've been talking about. But the overlapping issues in COVID-19 and Alzheimer's are really, really fascinating in terms of the risk. And so now is the time. Midlife is a critical component to all of this. So if you're in your late 40s and 50s, take note. It's time to get busy and to make sure that this is not a problem for you later in life, as well as now with COVID-19.
Yeah, I agree with you. I hope this COVID-19 is a wake-up call for us in health to say, I said this from day one, maybe, just maybe, there's going to be a percentage of people that say, you know what, if I'm at risk for this, what's the next thing coming down the pike? Because it never ends. And when this came out, I said, I'm not worried about this. I spent my last 30 years building my health. And I'm not in fear of this. I know that what I built is pretty solid. Is it 100%?
Yeah.
Nothing is, but I
Yeah.
think it's pretty close to it.
Yeah.
When's your next book coming out?
Well, the Improved Mind Diet should be out hopefully by October.
Awesome.
And working on that, working on a lot of things that just kind of are hard to manage in terms of the big picture, but the plan is to get it out as soon as possible. Believe me, it would have been out early. I thought I was going to get it out earlier this year, and one thing after the other.
I know. I've written a few books myself, and I want to write a new book. The title I've said for years is No Diapers for Me. And I think that might be a catchy title, and I can tie everything.
Oh, that's a great title.
I told my kids, I said, I'm going to live to 120. That's my goal. Healthy and no diapers. And I'm going to be feeding myself. I said,
that's so funny.
So you're not going to get life insurance money. I'm living a long time. So,
well, that's a very good point. You know, we touched on that in terms of assisted living and what that can look like. So good for you. You've been thinking ahead, sir.
I was just going to say, I'm thinking way ahead. I'm not even halfway through life yet. So I'm thinking ahead. Any crazy fun plans for the future? Anything fun you're going to do?
Well, my most fun thing that I have planned is to continue onward in my work, because I'm really vested in creating this nonprofit. You know, it's going to be a culmination of a lifetime, you know, and a pursuit that began, you know, back in my 40s, where I really wanted to change my life and my life path. Because, you know, when you're looking at your midlife and you're in your 40s and 50s, you have a little bit of a wake-up call and you go, my life's half over. You know, what's the last half going to look like? You know, and thinking ahead and all of that, I said, you know, I want the last half to be really significant, that it's going to mean something, not only for me, but for other people. And so the most fun thing that I can dream of is creating my foundation, my nonprofit, and just being at peace at what I've done and what I'm able to leave behind.
I love it. It's funny, every time I ask that question with these passionate health people, they all say the same thing. I'm waiting for somebody to say, I'm going hang gliding, I'm jumping out of an airplane. Nobody says it. I think I'm the only crazy guy that says, I'm playing rugby this season, but that's about as crazy for me. So I love it. I loved our time together. Our listeners are going to get.
Thank you, Dr. Tressler.
Yeah. And Guy, you got to get his book. Get on the website, contact Ralph with any of your questions. We're going to have all his contact information. But dive into this, and with his new book coming out, put that on your list to get, because the diet affects everything, and
wow, it does.
we got to look at this seriously. So Any last parting advice, guidance as we leave?
Nothing. I think we've covered it all. I'm so grateful for our time together because obviously you walk your talk, and you share that wisdom to your lucky patients. So God bless. Best wishes on your journey and the legacy that you're creating through your family and your health and wellness objectives and all the patients that you're working with. So thank you, Dr. Tressler.
I thank you, and thank you for saying that. We're all on the same team together, Ralph, and we're making this planet better. And we appreciate you listening to the show, and check out Ralph's information. It's life-changing. Thanks, Ralph.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.